Pennsylvania countryside, October 2023. An elderly woman with silver hair, pulled back in a practical bun, steps out of a dusty pickup truck, her weathered hands gripping a set of old brass keys. Before her stands a neglected farmhouse. It's white, paint peeling like autumn leaves, shutters hanging at odd angles. She clutches a letter from her late husband's estate attorney, the paper trembling slightly in the crisp fall breeze. What she's about to discover beneath rotting floorboards and behind crumbling walls will not only reshape American history, but prove that sometimes our greatest treasures lie hidden in the places we least expect to find them. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story captures your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have something extraordinary waiting for you. Margaret Eleanor Hartwell had driven 3 hours from her small apartment in Lancaster to reach this forgotten piece of her past. At 73, she moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned that rushing through life only led to missed opportunities and regrets. Her late husband, Robert, had inherited this 1847 farmhouse from a great-uncle she'd never met. But they'd never had the time or money to visit, let alone restore it. Now, 6 months after Robert's funeral, Margaret found herself the sole owner of 47 acres and a house that looked ready to collapse under the weight of its own memories. The October wind whipped through the overgrown fields, sending dried corn husks skittering across the gravel driveway. Margaret pulled her wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders and approached the front porch, noting how the wooden steps sagged under her modest weight. The brass key turned reluctantly in the lock, as if the house itself was hesitant to reveal its secrets. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of pale sunlight that filtered through grimy windows. The air smelled of old wood, forgotten years, and something else. Something almost metallic that Margaret couldn't identify. The main room was larger than she'd expected, with wide plank floors that creaked under her feet and a massive stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. Sheets covered furniture like ghosts of better times, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams like tattered curtains. Margaret set her purse on a dust-covered table and pulled out the file folder the attorney had given her. Inside were old photographs of the house in its prime, showing a prosperous-looking family standing on the front porch in the 1890s. The woman in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Margaret herself, the same determined jaw and intelligent eyes. According to the documents, this was Ezekiel Hartwell and his wife Sarah, Robert's great-great-grandparents, who had owned the property for over 50 years. "Well, Sarah," Margaret murmured to the photograph, "let's see what you and Ezekiel left behind." She spent the first hour simply walking through the rooms, taking inventory of what would need to be done. The kitchen was a disaster, with a pump-style well that probably hadn't worked in decades, and a cast-iron stove that was more rust than metal. The parlor contained furniture that might be valuable if properly restored, though the upholstery was beyond salvation. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms revealed water damage from a roof that clearly needed immediate attention. It was in the smallest bedroom, what might have served as a sewing room or study, that Margaret first noticed something odd. The wooden floorboards near the window seemed newer than the rest, though they'd been stained to match. When she knelt to examine them more closely, pressing her palm against the wood, she felt a slight give that suggested something hollow beneath. "That's strange," she said aloud, her voice echoing in the empty room. Margaret returned to her truck and retrieved the toolbox she'd brought, thinking she might need to make minor repairs during her inspection. Using a flathead screwdriver, she carefully pried at the edge of one of the suspicious floorboards. It came up more easily than expected, revealing a cavity that had been expertly concealed. Her heart began to race as she lifted out several more boards, exposing what appeared to be a purpose-built hiding place. Inside lay an oilcloth bundle, wrapped with extraordinary care and sealed with what looked like original wax. Beside it sat a small leather journal, its cover dark with age. With trembling hands, Margaret lifted out the journal first. The leather was supple, despite its obvious age, suggesting it had been well protected in its underground hiding place. She opened it carefully, squinting at the faded ink on yellowed pages. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as if written under stress. October 15th, 1842, she read aloud. The strangers came again today, asking questions about Father's work during the war. Sarah fears they mean us harm. I have decided to take the precaution Father advised, should such a day come. What he entrusted to our family must be preserved, whatever the cost. Margaret's pulse quickened. The war could only mean the Revolutionary War, which would place this journal entry some 60 years after American independence. She flipped through more pages, catching fragments of entries that spoke of visitors from Boston, concerns about those who would see history altered, and repeated references to Father's great trust. Setting the journal aside, Margaret turned, her attention to the oilcloth bundle. Her hands shook as she carefully unwrapped layers of protective material, each piece revealing something more precious than the last. Inside was a metal document tube, the kind used to protect important papers during travel or storage. The tube opened with surprising ease, as if it had been designed for exactly this moment. Margaret held her breath as she withdrew what appeared to be a large sheet of parchment rolled with infinite care. As she unrolled it on the floor beside the window, where the afternoon light was strongest, her world tilted on its axis. Before her lay what appeared to be an original copy of the Declaration of Independence, not a reproduction or a memorial. Copy, but something that had the weight and texture of authentic 18th century parchment. The signatures at the bottom were clear and bold, written in the distinctive hand of men she recognized from history books. John Hancock's signature sprawled across the bottom with its characteristic flourish, while Benjamin Franklin's more modest autograph sat nearby. Margaret sat back on her heels, staring at the document with a mixture of awe and disbelief. This couldn't be real. Original copies of the Declaration were accounted for, safely housed in museums and archives. Yet the parchment felt genuine under her fingers, and the ink had the faded quality of true age rather than modern reproduction. She returned to the journal, reading more carefully now. Ezekiel's ancestor, it seemed, had been Jonathan Hartwell, a printer and revolutionary sympathizer who had worked closely with the Continental Congress. According to the journal entries, Jonathan had been entrusted with creating several copies of the Declaration for distribution to the colonies, but had hidden one when British loyalists began hunting down those involved in its creation. "My God," Margaret whispered, the magnitude of her discovery settling over her like a weight. She carefully re-rolled the document and placed it back in its protective tube, her mind racing with implications. If this was authentic, it was beyond priceless. It was a piece of the very foundation of American democracy, hidden away in a Pennsylvania farmhouse for over a century and a half. But even as excitement coursed through her veins, Margaret felt the first stirrings of unease. The journal entries suggested that people had been looking for this document as recently as 1842. What if they were still looking? What if her discovery put her in danger? She gathered up the journal and the tube, rewrapping them carefully in the oilcloth before replacing the floorboards. The secret compartment was once again invisible, but Margaret knew she would never be able to look at this room the same way. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown fields. Margaret loaded her discoveries into the truck, checking repeatedly to make sure no one was watching. The country road remained empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in the space of a single afternoon. As she drove back toward Lancaster, Margaret's mind churned with questions and possibilities. Who could she trust with this discovery? How could she verify its authenticity without alerting the wrong people? And most importantly, what was she supposed to do with a piece of American history that had been hidden for good reason? The farmhouse receded in her rearview mirror, but Margaret knew she would be back. Tomorrow, she would begin the renovation, in earnest, using the work as cover, while she figured out what to do about the extraordinary secret now in her possession. What she didn't know was that her discovery would soon attract attention from people who had been searching for this very document for generations, people who would stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. The elderly widow had come to the farmhouse expecting to find a renovation project. Instead, she had uncovered a mystery that would test everything she thought she knew about trust, courage, and the true meaning of patriotism. Margaret barely slept that night. The document tube sat in her bedroom safe, but her mind wouldn't quiet. Every creak of her apartment building, every car passing on the street below, made her wonder if someone was coming for what she'd found. By dawn, she had made a decision that surprised even herself. She would return to the farmhouse immediately and begin the renovation as planned, using the work as a cover while she researched her discovery. The hardware store in nearby Ephrata was busy with Saturday morning customers when Margaret arrived with a list that would have impressed a professional contractor. Paint, brushes, cleaning supplies, basic tools, lumber for repairs, and enough materials to make the farmhouse livable. The clerk, a young man with calloused hands and paint under his fingernails, looked skeptical as he rang up her purchases. "That's quite a project you've got planned, ma'am," he said, loading bags into her cart. "You sure you don't want to hire some help? This is enough supplies for a full renovation." "I'm quite capable, thank you," Margaret replied, with more confidence than she felt. At 73, she had no business taking on such a massive undertaking, but she needed a legitimate reason to spend time at the farmhouse while she figured out what to do about the declaration. The drive back to the property felt different. In daylight, the farmhouse looked less forbidding, more like a challenge waiting to be met. Margaret had always been practical, a trait that had served her well during 47 years of marriage to a man who preferred dreams to action. Now, for the first time in months, she felt purpose flowing through her veins. She was unloading her truck when a battered pickup pulled into the driveway, trailing dust and the sound of a diesel engine that had seen better days. Margaret tensed, her hand instinctively moving toward her purse, where she'd hidden a can of pepper spray. A tall man emerged from the driver's side, moving with the careful gait of someone whose joints had protested years of hard labor. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, with graying brown hair and hands that spoke of a lifetime working with tools. His flannel shirt was clean but worn, and his work boots had the scuffed appearance of equipment that got daily use. Despite his weathered appearance, his eyes were kind, and he approached with the cautious respect of someone who understood property. Boundaries. "Morning, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his baseball cap. "I'm Daniel Mackenzie. I live about a mile down the road." He gestured vaguely toward the east. "Saw the activity yesterday and figured I'd better introduce myself. Haven't seen anyone around this place in years." Margaret studied him carefully. Her instincts, honed by decades of evaluating people in her work as a librarian, suggested honesty. Still, she kept her distance. "Margaret Hartwell. I inherited the property from my late husband." "Hartwell," Daniel repeated, his eyebrows rising. "Well, I'll be. Your husband related to the family that built this place? Great-great-nephew, according to the lawyers. We never visited while he was alive." Margaret hefted a bag of cleaning supplies, testing whether this stranger would offer help or simply satisfy his curiosity. Without hesitation, Daniel stepped forward. "Here, let me get that. These bags are heavy, and that porch step isn't as solid as it looks." He lifted the supplies with ease, waiting for her permission before approaching the house. Margaret found herself nodding. Something about Daniel Mackenzie's manner put her at ease, though she remained cautious. You knew the previous owners? Not exactly. House has been empty as long as I've lived here, and that's been 15 years. But my grandfather used to tell stories about the Hartwells, said they were good people, kept to themselves, but helped neighbors when times got tough. Daniel set the bags on the porch and looked up at the house's facade. She's got good bones. This old place, lot of work needed, but nothing that can't be fixed with time and effort. Margaret watched him assess the property with professional eyes. You're in construction. Retired now, but I spent 30 years doing restoration work, specialized in historic properties. Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. Actually, I've been curious about this house for years. The architectural details suggest it's older than most people realize. Some of the craftsmanship looks like late 1700s work, not 1847 like the county records claim. The observation sent a chill down Margaret's spine. If the house was older than documented, it lent credibility to her discovery. What makes you think of that? Daniel pointed to the stonework around the foundation. See how those stones are cut? That's hand-quarried work, the kind they did before industrial tools became common. And the window frames, the way they're mortised and tenoned. That's old-school joinery. He looked at her curiously. You planning to restore her yourself? Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. The question sounded reasonable, but she heard the underlying skepticism. I'm more capable than I appear, Mr. Mackenzie. Oh, I don't doubt that, Daniel said quickly. It's just, well, it's a big job for anyone, even with help. He hesitated, then continued. Look, I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but I've got time on my hands these days. Retirement doesn't suit me as well as I thought it would. If you need assistance, or even just advice on where to start, I'd be happy to help. Margaret's initial reaction was to refuse. She'd spent 6 months learning to be independent after Robert's death, and accepting help felt like admitting defeat. But practical considerations overrode pride. Having someone around would provide cover for her activities, and Daniel's expertise could prove invaluable. What would you want in return? She asked bluntly. Daniel's laugh was genuine. Honestly, something to do. My wife passed 3 years ago, kids live in other states, and I'm about to go crazy rattling around my empty house. I'd rather be working with my hands than watching daytime television. The admission of loneliness struck Margaret unexpectedly. She recognized the feeling, the way grief could make even busy days feel hollow. I can't pay much, she warned. Not looking for payment, just looking for purpose. Daniel gestured toward the house. Besides, a place like this deserves to be brought back to life. Seems like a shame to let all that history crumble away. His mention of history made Margaret's chest tighten, but she nodded slowly. All right, Mr. Mackenzie, but I'm in charge. This is my project. Wouldn't have it any other way, Mrs. Hartwell. They spent the next hour unloading supplies and conducting a thorough inspection of the house. Daniel's knowledge was immediately apparent as he identified structural issues. Margaret would never have noticed. The roof needed more work than she'd realized. Several support beams in the basement showed signs of rot, and the plumbing was a disaster waiting to happen. Good news is, none of it's insurmountable, Daniel explained as they stood in the kitchen, surveying the damage. Bad news is, it's going to take months, not weeks. Margaret felt relief rather than discouragement. Months would give her time to research the declaration, to figure out what to do with her discovery. Where should we start? Foundation first, always. Can't build on unstable ground. Daniel opened his toolbox and withdrew a flashlight. Let's take a closer look at that basement. Some of those support posts looked questionable. They descended the narrow stairs into the farmhouse's stone foundation. The basement was larger than Margaret expected, with several rooms that might have served as root cellars or storage areas. Daniel moved methodically, checking joints and supports, while Margaret followed with growing amazement at the structure's complexity. This is interesting, Daniel said, crouching near a wall in the back corner. "See how this stonework is different, newer, but not recent. Maybe added 50 or 60 years after the original construction." Margaret knelt beside him, her pulse in quickening. If renovations had been made in the 1840s, around the time of Ezekiel's journal entries, it might explain other hidden spaces. "What do you think it was for?" "Hard to say. Could be reinforcement, could be concealment. Old houses are full of mysteries." Daniel stood and brushed dust from his knees. "We'll know more once we start working on it." They emerged from the basement as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Margaret felt energized despite the overwhelming scope of work ahead. Having Daniel's expertise would make the renovation possible, and his presence would provide cover for her real activities. "I should head home," Daniel said, gathering his tools. "Church tomorrow, but I could be back Monday morning if you're serious about starting." "I'm serious," Margaret confirmed. "But Mr. Mackenzie, I should mention, I value privacy. I'm not looking for social visits or people dropping by to check on our progress." Daniel nodded, understanding. "Grief makes folks want solitude. I get it. We'll work, not chat." He paused at his truck door. "One thing, though. You might want to let Sheriff Morrison know you're planning to spend time out here. Empty properties sometimes attract the wrong kind of attention." The suggestion sent another chill through Margaret. What kind of attention? Oh, probably nothing. Serious. Teenagers looking for party spots, maybe urban explorers hunting for antiques. But it's always better to have law enforcement aware of legitimate activity. Daniel climbed into his truck. "See you Monday morning, Mrs. Hartwell." As his truck disappeared down the road, Margaret realized she'd made a significant decision without fully considering its implications. She'd accepted help from a stranger, someone who would be present while she researched the most important historical discovery of her lifetime. The practical benefits were obvious, but the risks were real. Inside the house, she returned to the small upstairs room where she'd made her discovery. The floorboards showed no sign of disturbance, but Margaret knew what lay beneath. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of verifying her find, while maintaining the fiction of a simple renovation. She spent the remainder of the afternoon cleaning the main floor, scrubbing away years of neglect while her mind worked through possibilities. The declaration needed professional authentication, but that required experts she couldn't trust to keep the discovery quiet. The journal suggested people had been hunting for this document in 1842. Were they still searching? Had her late husband's family been targeted because of their connection to the original owner? As darkness fell, Margaret made one final check of the house before locking up. Standing in the main room, surrounded by cleaning supplies and renovation materials, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just restoring a farmhouse. She was protecting a piece of American history that someone had risked everything to preserve. The drive back to Lancaster gave her time to plan. Monday would bring Daniel Mackenzie and the beginning of real work. She would need to be careful, finding opportunities to research the declaration without arousing suspicion. The document remained in her apartment safe, but she couldn't leave it there forever. Eventually, decisions would have to be made about its future. What Margaret didn't know was that her activities had already been noticed. A car had been parked on the county road earlier that afternoon, its occupant photographing everyone who came and went from the Hartwell property. By tomorrow, people in Boston and Washington would know that someone was renovating the old farmhouse, and the search that had begun in 1842 would enter a new and dangerous phase. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of late October, and Margaret found herself at the farmhouse before 7, coffee steaming in a thermos beside her as she sat in the truck, gathering courage for what lay ahead. She had spent Sunday researching everything she could find about the Hartwell family and the Revolutionary War period, making careful notes in a composition book she planned to hide among her renovation materials. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that her discovery was authentic. Daniel Mackenzie arrived precisely at 8, his truck loaded with additional tools and what appeared to be lumber for immediate repairs. He moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone accustomed to starting workdays early, acknowledging Margaret with a respectful nod before beginning to unload equipment. "Figured we'd start with the roof," he said, pulling on worn work gloves. "Rain's forecast for later this week, and those leaks will only get worse." He gestured toward a ladder strapped to his truck bed. "I brought scaffolding, but it's a 2-person job to set up safely." Margaret had never worked with scaffolding, but she approached the task with the same determination that had carried her through 6 months of widowhood. Daniel proved to be a patient teacher, explaining each step clearly and never making her feel incompetent when she struggled with unfamiliar equipment. Within an hour, they had erected a stable platform that allowed safe access to the farmhouse's steep roof. "You've done this before," Daniel observed as Margaret climbed the scaffolding with increasing confidence. "Librarian for 38 years, she replied, testing the stability of each board before putting her full weight on it. "You learn to adapt quickly when dealing with unexpected situations." They worked in comfortable silence for the first part of the morning, Daniel identifying damaged shingles while Margaret carefully removed the old materials and sorted them for disposal. The physical labor felt good after months of sedentary grief, and she found herself enjoying the challenge of learning new skills. It was Daniel who first noticed the car. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, not looking up from his work. "Don't turn. Around, obvious-like, but there's a sedan been parked on the county road for about 20 minutes, just sitting there." Margaret's hands stilled on the shingle she was removing. "Probably someone lost, checking their phone for directions?" "Maybe," Daniel said, though his tone suggested skepticism. "Except the driver's got binoculars, and they're pointed this way." The news sent ice through Margaret's veins, but she forced herself to continue working while her mind raced. 3 days since her discovery, and someone was already watching the property. The journal's warnings about people searching for the document seemed more relevant than historical curiosity. "What do you think we should do?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "Nothing right now. Could be innocent, could be trouble. Either way, acting spooked will only make things worse." Daniel continued his methodical examination of the roof damage, "But maybe we should make plans for unexpected visitors." The sedan remained for another 10 minutes before finally driving away, but its presence cast a shadow over the remainder of the morning. Margaret found herself glancing frequently toward the road, and she noticed Daniel doing the same. By lunch, both were tense, despite their attempts to maintain normal conversation. "I need to ask you something," Margaret said as they sat on the farmhouse porch, sharing sandwiches she'd brought from town. "When you mentioned letting the sheriff know about our work here, were you thinking of anything specific?" Daniel chewed, thoughtfully before answering. "Rural properties sometimes attract attention from people looking for easy targets. Empty houses, isolated locations, elderly owners working alone." He met her eyes directly. "But that car this morning wasn't looking for burglary opportunities. That was surveillance." The blunt assessment confirmed Margaret's fears. What would someone be surveilling? That's what worries me. Could be they're planning something. Could be they're looking for something. Daniel set down his sandwich and studied the farmhouse with new attention. "Mrs. Hartwell, is there anything about this property you haven't mentioned? Family stories, historical significance, anything that might attract unwanted interest?" Margaret felt the weight of her secret pressing against her chest. Daniel had already proven himself trustworthy and skilled, exactly the kind of ally she needed. but revealing the declaration would put him in danger and complicate an already precarious situation. "My husband's family never talked much about their history," she said carefully, "just that they'd owned land in Pennsylvania for generations." Daniel nodded, but his expression suggested he sensed there was more to the story. "Well, whatever's going on, we should be prepared. I'll talk to Sheriff Morrison this afternoon, let him know we're working out here regularly, and maybe we should vary our schedule, not be predictable." They returned to work after lunch, focusing on securing the roof before weather could cause additional damage. Margaret was learning to nail shingles with acceptable accuracy when Daniel called her attention to something he'd discovered near the chimney. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a section of brickwork that appeared newer than the surrounding masonry. "This chimney's been modified, probably sometime in the 1800s. See how these bricks are a slightly different color?" Margaret climbed carefully across the roof to examine Daniel's discovery. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable once pointed out. "What kind of modification?" "Hard to tell from up here, but it looks like they might have added an additional flue or changed the internal structure." Daniel ran his hands over the newer brickwork. "We'll need to look at it from inside the house. Sometimes these old places have hidden passages or storage areas built into the chimney structure. The possibility of additional hiding places made Margaret's pulse quicken, but she forced herself to respond with casual interest. "That sounds fascinating. Historical preservation?" "Could be or could be practical. During certain periods, people had reasons to hide things. Civil War era, Prohibition, even earlier." Daniel began gathering his tools as afternoon shadows lengthened. "We'll investigate tomorrow, after we finish securing this section of roof." They worked until 5, accomplishing more in one day than Margaret had expected. The farmhouse was beginning to look cared for rather than abandoned, and she felt genuine satisfaction in the physical labor. But underneath her contentment ran a current of anxiety about the mysterious sedan and what it might represent. "I'll be here early tomorrow," Daniel said as he loaded his truck. "Want to get that chimney investigation done before we lose good light." After Daniel left, Margaret remained at the farmhouse longer than planned, using the excuse of cleaning up to satisfy her real purpose, examining the small upstairs room where she'd found the declaration. She lifted the concealed floorboards carefully, checking that the hiding place remained undisturbed. The empty cavity reassured her that her secret was still safe, but Daniel's mention of additional hiding places suggested the house might hold other surprises. She was replacing the boards when she heard a car engine approaching. Margaret's heart raced as she quickly repositioned the furniture to conceal any sign of disturbance, then moved to the window. A sheriff's patrol car was pulling into the driveway, and she recognized the driver as a middle-aged officer with graying hair and a professional demeanor. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, opening the front door before he could knock. "Mrs. Hartwell, Dan Mackenzie called. Said you folks were doing some renovation work out here." Sheriff Morrison touched his hat brim respectfully. "Thought I'd stop by, introduce myself properly." Margaret invited him inside, grateful for the legitimate excuse to speak with law enforcement. Sheriff Morrison examined the work they'd accomplished, with obvious approval, asking knowledgeable questions about their plans and timeline. "Dan's good people," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Margaret's thermos. "Lost his wife to cancer a few years back, been kind of adrift ever since. This project's probably good for both of you." They talked for 20 minutes about the renovation, the history of the area, and practical concerns about working on an isolated property. Margaret was preparing to ask about the sedan when Sheriff Morrison brought up the subject himself. "Dan mentioned you might have had some unwanted attention today. Car parked on the road watching the property?" "Yes, for about half an hour this morning. The driver had binoculars." Margaret tried to sound matter-of-fact rather than worried. Sheriff Morrison's expression grew more serious. "That's the second report I've had this week about unusual surveillance. In this area, Mrs. Henderson up the road noticed a similar car yesterday, different license plate but same behavior. The news that surveillance extended beyond the farmhouse sent fresh alarm through Margaret. What do you think it means? Could be several things. Sometimes it's people looking for property to buy. Sometimes it's folks with less honest intentions. Sheriff Morrison set down his coffee cup and studied Margaret carefully. Mrs. Hartwell, is there anything about your family's connection to this property that might attract attention? Historical significance, valuable items, anything that might make people curious. The direct question put Margaret in an impossible position. Lying to law enforcement felt wrong, but revealing the declaration would create complications she wasn't prepared to handle. Nothing I'm aware of, Sheriff. My husband inherited the property, but we never visited while he was alive. Sheriff Morrison nodded, though his eyes suggested the same skepticism Margaret had seen in Daniel's expression. Well, could be coincidence, could be something more. Either way, I'll have my deputies increase patrols in this area. And Mrs. Hartwell, if you notice anything unusual, don't hesitate to call. Rural properties can be vulnerable, especially when people know there's valuable restoration work happening. After the sheriff left, Margaret sat in the farmhouse's main room as darkness gathered outside, wrestling with decisions that grew more complex by the hour. The surveillance, Sheriff Morrison's questions, and Daniel's expertise with historic properties all suggested that her secret was becoming harder to protect. Yet revealing the declaration prematurely could put the document at risk and endanger people who were trying to help her. She made one final check of the house before leaving, ensuring that all windows were locked and that nothing appeared out of place. The drive back to Lancaster felt longer than usual, every car in her rearview mirror a potential threat. In her apartment, she opened the safe and carefully examined the declaration one more time, looking for details that might help authenticate its origins without involving experts who couldn't be trusted. The parchment felt genuine under her fingers, and the signatures appeared to match historical examples she'd found in her research. But professional verification would require resources and expertise beyond her capabilities. She needed allies, but every person she involved increased the risk of exposure. Margaret spent the evening making lists and plans, trying to balance her need for help against the requirement for secrecy. Daniel Mackenzie had already proven himself trustworthy and skilled, and his knowledge of historic properties might be essential for understanding what else the farmhouse might contain. Sheriff Morrison seemed honest and professional, but involving law enforcement would inevitably lead to questions she wasn't ready to answer. As she prepared for bed, Margaret made a decision that would irrevocably change the trajectory of her situation. Tomorrow, she would begin testing Daniel's trustworthiness by sharing small pieces of what she'd discovered. If he proved reliable with minor secrets, she might eventually trust him with the larger truth. The alternative, protecting the declaration alone while unknown enemies closed in, seemed increasingly impossible. What Margaret didn't know was that the surveillance team had identified her truck's license plate and traced it back to her Lancaster apartment. By morning, people who had been searching for the declaration for generations would know exactly who she was and where to find her. The game of cat and mouse that had begun with her discovery was about to become much more dangerous, and her decision to trust Daniel Mackenzie would soon be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. The renovation of the farmhouse was proceeding according to plan, but the real battle for the Declaration of Independence was only beginning. Tuesday morning brought overcast skies and the smell of rain in the air, but Margaret arrived at the farmhouse with renewed determination. She had spent the night rehearsing how to begin testing Daniel's trustworthiness, settling on a strategy that would reveal her discovery gradually while gauging his reactions. The composition book containing her research sat hidden beneath legitimate renovation notes, and she had prepared several questions that might reveal his knowledge of Revolutionary War history without seeming suspicious. Daniel arrived punctually, but Margaret immediately noticed a change in his demeanor. His usual easy confidence was replaced by watchful tension, and he spent several minutes scanning the property before unloading his tools. "Everything all right?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would complicate her plans. "Had a visitor last night," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. "Man in an expensive suit, claimed to be researching local history for some genealogy project. Asked a lot of questions about the Hartwell property, seemed to know more about your family than he was letting on." Margaret's chest tightened. "What kind of questions?" "Specific ones. When the house was built, who lived here during the Civil War era, whether any family documents or artifacts might still be on the property." Daniel's eyes met hers directly. "Mrs. Hartwell, this man wasn't a genealogist. He was fishing for information, and he was very interested in your renovation project." The news confirmed Margaret's worst fears about the surveillance, but also presented an opportunity. Daniel was clearly suspicious about outside interest in the property, which might make him more receptive to the truth about what she'd discovered. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "Nothing useful. Said I'd just started working here, didn't know anything about the family history." Daniel pulled on his work gloves with sharp, efficient movements. "But here's the thing, Mrs. Hartwell. This, and new things about the Hartwell family that aren't in any public records I've ever seen. He mentioned your husband's great-great-grandfather by name, knew about property transfers that happened in the 1840s. Margaret absorbed this information while her mind raced through implications. If strangers possessed detailed knowledge of her family's history, they were far more organized and dangerous than she'd realized. The time for half-truths and evasion was ending rapidly. "Daniel," she said carefully, "there's something I need to discuss with you, but first I need to know I can trust you completely." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, a combination of relief and anticipation that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation. "Mrs. Hartwell, whatever's going on here, I'm already involved whether we acknowledge it or not. That man last night made it clear that people are watching this property for reasons that have nothing to do with renovation." They stood facing each other in the farmhouse's main room, morning light filtering through windows they'd cleaned together just yesterday. Margaret realized she was at a crossroads that would determine not only the fate of her discovery, but potentially both their safety. "What I'm about to tell you must remain absolutely confidential," she began. "Lives could depend on it, including ours." Daniel nodded gravely. "You have my word." Margaret led him upstairs to the small room where she'd made her discovery, closing the door behind them despite the empty house. With careful precision, she moved aside the furniture and lifted the concealed floorboards, revealing the hiding place that had protected secrets for over a century. "I found this on my first day here," she said, withdrawing the leather journal from its oilcloth wrapping. "There was something else, something that I've moved to a secure location until I could figure out what to do." Daniel accepted the journal with reverent care, immediately recognizing its age and significance. He read several entries in silence, his expression growing more amazed with each page. "My God," he whispered finally. "This is talking about hiding. Something during the Revolutionary War period. Something important enough that people were still hunting for it 60 years later." "Keep reading," Margaret said quietly. Daniel continued through the journal, stopping occasionally to reread passages that seemed particularly significant. When he reached the entries describing Jonathan Hartwell's work with the Continental Congress, his hands began to tremble slightly. "A printer," he said, looking up at Margaret with dawning understanding. "Jonathan Hartwell was involved in printing copies of founding documents." "Not just involved," Margaret corrected. "According to family records I've researched, he was specifically commissioned to create distribution copies of the Declaration of Independence for the individual colonies. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, processing the implications. And one of those copies is what I found with this journal, a complete, signed copy of the Declaration of Independence, hidden here since before 1842. Margaret watched. Daniel's face carefully, looking for any sign of greed or deception that might indicate divided loyalties. Instead, she saw wonder mixed with concern, the expression of someone who understood both the historical significance and the potential danger of such a discovery. "Margaret," Daniel said, using her first name for the first time, "do you realize what this means? An authenticated Revolutionary War-era copy of the Declaration would be beyond priceless. It would rewrite parts of American history." "I'm beginning to understand that," Margaret replied. "I'm also beginning to understand why people are watching this property." Daniel closed the journal carefully and handed it back to her. "Where is the document now?" "Someplace safe, but not permanently secure. I need to figure out how to authenticate it without alerting the wrong people, and how to protect it until proper arrangements can be made." They spent the next hour discussing options while continuing their renovation work as cover. Daniel's knowledge of historic preservation proved invaluable as he explained the authentication process and the network of experts, collectors, and institutions involved in American Revolutionary artifacts. "The problem," he explained while they examined the modified chimney he'd noticed the previous day, "is that something this significant can't be kept secret indefinitely. Too many people have legitimate reasons to be interested, and the historical community is smaller than you might think." Inside the house, Daniel's examination of the chimney revealed exactly what he'd suspected: additional modifications that created hidden spaces within the structure. Using a flashlight and mirror, he identified what appeared to be a concealed compartment accessible from the fireplace. "This is sophisticated work," he said, running his hands along the interior stonework. "Someone went to considerable trouble to create secure hiding places throughout this house." Margaret felt excitement building as they worked to access the hidden compartment. If Jonathan Hartwell had hidden the Declaration here, he might have concealed other important items as well. The chimney modification could contain additional documents, artifacts, or information that would help authenticate her discovery. It took careful work to locate the mechanism that opened the hidden space, but Daniel's experience with historic construction finally paid off. A specific sequence of pressure points caused a section of stonework to swing inward, revealing a cavity lined with oiled leather to protect its contents from moisture and temperature changes. Inside, they found a smaller collection of items: additional letters, what appeared to be printing plates wrapped in cloth, and a wooden box that contained tools Margaret didn't recognize. "Printing equipment," Daniel identified, examining the tools with growing excitement. "This is a complete set of 18th century typesetting and printing implements." The letters proved even more significant. Written by various members of the Continental Congress, they provided detailed instructions for the creation and distribution of official documents, including specific references to the copies of the Declaration that Jonathan Hartwell had been commissioned to produce. "This is it," Margaret said, reading over Daniel's shoulder. "This is the documentation that proves my copy is authentic." But their excitement was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the farmhouse. Multiple engines, moving fast, suggested more than casual visitors. Daniel immediately moved to the window, his expression darkening as he counted the cars pulling into the driveway. 4 vehicles, 8 or 9 people, he reported quietly. "This isn't social." Margaret quickly gathered the items they'd found, rewrapping them carefully before concealing them in the oilcloth bundle. Her hands moved with surprising steadiness despite her racing heart. "Is there another way out of the house?" she asked. "Back," Door leads to the old root cellar. From there, we could reach the woods behind the property. Daniel checked the window again, but they're already positioning themselves to cover all exits. A knock at the front door interrupted their planning, followed by a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Agent Collins with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to speak with you about items that may have been discovered on this property." Margaret and Daniel exchanged glances. The arrival of federal agents suggested the situation was far more serious than they'd realized, but it also offered potential legitimacy that private collectors or criminal organizations couldn't provide. "What do you think?" Margaret whispered. "FBI could be legitimate, could be people impersonating federal agents." Daniel replied quietly. "Either way, we're not in a position to run." Margaret made the decision that would determine the next phase of their adventure. She would cooperate with the agents, but cautiously, revealing information gradually while attempting to verify their credentials and intentions. "Coming," she called, then turned to Daniel. "Whatever happens, the items we found stay hidden until we're certain these people are trustworthy." They descended the stairs together, Margaret carrying the journal, while Daniel positioned himself protectively nearby. Through the front windows, she could see several people in dark suits, standing around expensive sedans, their posture and equipment suggesting law enforcement training. Agent Collins proved to be a woman in her 40s with short grey hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She displayed credentials that appeared genuine, but Margaret had no way to verify their authenticity. "Mrs. Hartwell, we've been monitoring unusual activity around this property as part of an ongoing investigation into the theft of historical artifacts." Agent Collins's tone was professional but not unfriendly. "We have reason to believe that items of national significance may be hidden somewhere on these premises." "What kind of items?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Documents related to the founding of our nation. Specifically, copies of the Declaration of Independence that were created for distribution during the Revolutionary War period." Agent Collins studied Margaret's expression carefully. "We have intelligence suggesting that one such document has been hidden on this property since the 1840s. The agent's knowledge was too specific to be coincidental, which meant either the FBI had legitimate information about the Declaration, or Margaret was dealing with sophisticated criminals who had done extensive research. "I'm renovating the house," Margaret said carefully. "We've found some old family documents, but nothing that would be of national significance." "Mrs. Hartwell," Agent Collins said, her tone growing more serious, "I need to be frank with you. There are people looking for this document who don't represent the interests of the United States government. If you found anything unusual, your safety may depend on cooperation with federal authorities." Daniel stepped forward. "Agent Collins, before Mrs. Hartwell says anything else, we'd like to verify your credentials through official channels. Too many people have been asking questions about this property for us to take anyone at face value." Agent Collins nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what you should do. Here's the number for the FBI field office in Philadelphia. As for Agent in Charge Patricia Williams, tell her you're calling about Operation Founding Father. The specific operation name and willingness to provide verification convinced Margaret that these agents were legitimate, but cooperation would mean revealing her discovery and losing control over what happened to the Declaration. "If we have found something significant," she said carefully, "what would happen to it?" "Items of historical significance belong to the American people," Agent Collins replied. "They would be authenticated by experts, then housed in appropriate institutions where they could be studied and displayed safely." Margaret looked at Daniel, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his expression. They had reached the moment where half measures and secrecy would no longer be sufficient. The hidden document that had remained secret for over a century was about to become the center of a federal investigation, with consequences neither of them could fully predict. "Agent Collins," Margaret said finally, "I think we need to have a longer conversation." Agent Collins led Margaret and Daniel into the farmhouse's main room, while her team maintained positions around the property that suggested both protection and containment. Two agents remained by the vehicles, scanning the surrounding countryside, with practiced vigilance, while another positioned himself near the back door. The professional coordination impressed Margaret, but it also made clear that retreat was no longer an option. "Before we proceed," Agent Collins said, settling into one of the chairs Margaret had cleaned the previous day, "I want you to understand the broader context of what we're dealing with here." She opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several photographs. These are surveillance images taken over the past month at various locations across the eastern seaboard: museums, private collections, auction houses, libraries. Notice anything? Margaret studied the photographs carefully. In each image, she could identify the same faces appearing at different locations, people who seemed to be conducting systematic searches or inquiries. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, his expression growing more concerned as he recognized the pattern. "They're looking for something specific," Daniel observed. "Same people, different places, all connected to Revolutionary War artifacts." "Exactly. We've been tracking this organization for 18 months. They call themselves the Heritage Foundation. But they're essentially a criminal enterprise, specializing in the theft and illegal sale of American historical artifacts." Agent Collins arranged the photographs in chronological order. 3 weeks ago, our surveillance detected increased activity focused on Pennsylvania properties with documented connections to Revolutionary War families. Margaret felt her chest tighten as the implications became clear. "You think they know about this property? We know they do. Yesterday, we intercepted communications indicating they had identified the Hartwell farmhouse as a high-priority target." Agent Collins fixed Margaret with a direct stare. "Mrs. Hartwell, these people have killed to acquire artifacts of lesser significance than what we believe may be hidden here." The blunt statement sent ice through Margaret's veins. The mysterious sedan, the man who had questioned Daniel, the surveillance they'd noticed, all suddenly took on a more sinister character. She was no longer dealing with curious collectors or academic researchers, but with criminals who viewed murder as an acceptable business expense. "What exactly do you think is hidden here?" Margaret asked, though she knew the question was largely theatrical. Agent Collins opened another folder, this one containing historical documents and research materials. "Jonathan Hartwell, your husband's ancestor, was commissioned by the Continental Congress to create multiple copies of the Declaration of Independence for distribution to the individual colonies. Most of these copies are accounted for, housed in museums or known private collections, but one has been missing since 1842. She spread out copies of historical correspondence, including letters that matched the tone and content of entries Margaret had read in Ezekiel's journal. Contemporary accounts suggest that Jonathan Hartwell became concerned about British loyalists targeting people involved in the Declaration's creation and distribution. He apparently hid one copy, along with documentation proving its authenticity, somewhere on this property." Agent Collins looked around the farmhouse with professional assessment. "Given the sophisticated hiding places we've identified during our preliminary survey, we believe that copy may still be here." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Preliminary survey? We've had this property under discreet observation for 2 weeks, Mrs. Hartwell. We know about your discovery in the upstairs room, and we know you've moved something off the property for safekeeping." Agent Collins's tone remained matter-of-fact, but Margaret detected an undertone of respect. "We also know you've been conducting research into authentication methods and historical documentation." The revelation that her activities had been monitored was disturbing, but Margaret found herself oddly reassured by the agent's restraint. If they had wanted to simply seize the declaration, they could have done so at any time. "Why haven't you just searched the property?" she asked. "Because we need your cooperation for this operation to succeed," Agent Collins replied. "The Heritage Foundation isn't just after the declaration itself. They're looking for the complete collection, including authentication documents and any related artifacts. If we can convince them that you've found what they're seeking, we can use this property as bait to capture the entire organization." Margaret and Daniel exchanged glances, both understanding that they were being asked to participate in a federal law enforcement operation that would put them directly in harm's way. "You want us to act as decoys," Daniel said. "I want you to continue your renovation work while appearing to make discoveries that would interest the Heritage Foundation. Meanwhile, our team will be positioned to intervene when they make their move." Agent Collins leaned forward, her expression becoming more personal. "Mrs. Hartwell, these people will not stop looking. Your only real safety lies in helping us eliminate the threat permanently." Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the property that had become the center of an investigation she never could have imagined. The farmhouse that had seemed like a simple renovation project now felt like the stage for a confrontation between federal law enforcement and organized and criminals. "If I have found the declaration," she said carefully, "what guarantees do I have that it will be handled properly? That it won't disappear into some government warehouse or be claimed by institutions that had nothing to do with its preservation?" Agent Collins joined her at the window. "I can't make promises about ultimate disposition, Mrs. Hartwell. That will be determined by courts and cultural institutions far above my pay grade. But I can promise that any artifacts will be authenticated by the most qualified experts in the country, and that your family's role in preserving American history will be fully acknowledged." It was Daniel who posed the question that had been troubling Margaret since the agent's arrival. "How do we know you're really FBI? With everything that's happened, we've learned to be suspicious of people claiming authority." Agent Collins smiled, for the first time since entering the house. "Smart question. Agent Morrison," she called to one of her team members positioned near the door. "Please contact Agent in Charge Williams and have her speak directly with Mrs. Hartwell and Mr. Mackenzie." Within minutes, Margaret found herself speaking by phone with a woman whose credentials could be verified through multiple official channels. Agent Williams confirmed not only the legitimacy of Agent Collins and her team, but also provided details about Operation Founding Father that convinced Margaret they were dealing with genuine federal law enforcement. "Mrs. Hartwell," Agent Williams said over the phone, "I want you to understand that your cooperation is voluntary, but your situation is genuinely dangerous. The Heritage Foundation has escalated to violence in the past, and they view this particular artifact as worth any risk." After ending the call, Margaret sat quietly for several minutes, weighing options that all seemed to carry significant risks. Cooperation with the FBI offered protection and legitimate handling of the declaration, but it also meant surrendering control over her discovery and potentially putting herself in the middle of a law enforcement operation. Refusing cooperation would leave her vulnerable to criminals who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. "I need to see the document," Agent Collins said gently, "not to seize it, but to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Authentication will require specific expertise, and planning our operation will depend on knowing what the Heritage Foundation is actually seeking." Margaret looked at Daniel, seeing her own resolution reflected in his expression. They had trusted each other with dangerous secrets, and now they needed to extend that trust to people whose motives were professional rather than personal. "It's not here," Margaret said finally. I moved it to a secure location after I realized. People were watching the property? Where? Agent Collins asked. My apartment in Lancaster, in a safe deposit box at First National Bank. Margaret felt relief at finally sharing the burden of protecting the document. But there's more. We found additional items today hidden in the chimney. Printing equipment, correspondence, documentation that would help authenticate the declaration. Agent Collins's eyes sharpened with interest. Show me. They led the federal agents upstairs, where Margaret and Daniel demonstrated the hidden compartments they'd discovered in both the floorboards and the chimney structure. Agent Collins examined each hiding place with professional thoroughness, taking photographs and making detailed notes. This is sophisticated concealment work, she observed, studying the mechanism that operated the chimney compartment. Jonathan Hartwell wasn't just hiding one document. He created a complete secure archive. The additional letters and printing equipment proved as significant as Margaret had hoped. Agent Collins photographed each item carefully, explaining that they would provide crucial context for authenticating the declaration and understanding its historical significance. These letters include specific details about the paper, ink, and printing methods used for the official copies, she explained. They're like a fingerprint for identifying authentic documents from that period. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Agent Collins outlined the plan for Operation Founding Father. Margaret and Daniel would continue their renovation work, but with federal agents positioned discreetly around the property. They would also begin making carefully controlled statements in town, suggesting that their work had uncovered historically significant items. The Heritage Foundation has informants throughout the antiquities community, Agent Collins explained. Word of your discoveries will reach them within days, possibly hours. When they make their move, we'll be ready. Margaret found herself agreeing to the plan, though part of her wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. The farmhouse renovation that had begun as a simple project to give purpose to her widowhood was now the center of a federal law enforcement operation targeting dangerous criminals. There's one more thing, Agent Collins said, as her team prepared to establish their surveillance positions. We have reason to believe the Heritage Foundation has been monitoring your activities for longer than we initially realized. It's possible they know about your research, your visits to the bank, even your conversations with local law enforcement. The implication sent a chill through Margaret. You think they know I've found the declaration? We think they suspect it. Strongly enough to take significant risks, which means the next few days will be critical. Agent Collins handed Margaret a small communication device. Direct line to our team. Any unusual activity, any unexpected visitors, anyone asking questions about your work here, you contact us immediately. As the FBI team dispersed to their positions, Margaret and Daniel found themselves alone in the farmhouse for the first time. Since morning, the day's revelations had transformed their understanding of both the danger they faced and the significance of Margaret's discovery. Are we doing the right thing? Margaret asked as they packed up their tools and prepared to leave. For the day, I think we're doing the only thing that makes sense, Daniel replied. These Heritage Foundation people aren't going to give up, and we can't protect something this important by ourselves. They secured the house carefully, ensuring that both the obvious renovation work and the hidden compartments showed no signs of disturbance. As they walked to their vehicles, Margaret was acutely aware of invisible watchers positioned somewhere among the trees and hills surrounding the property. The drive back to Lancaster felt different now that she knew federal agents were monitoring her movements for protection rather than surveillance. But it also felt more dangerous, knowing that other people with less benevolent intentions might be watching as well. In her apartment that evening, Margaret opened the safe deposit box one more time, examining the declaration with new understanding of its historical significance and the forces it had set in motion. Tomorrow, she would return to the farmhouse and continue the renovation that was now serving as cover for a federal law enforcement operation. What she didn't know was that the Heritage Foundation had indeed identified her as the person who had found Jonathan Hartwell's hidden archive. By morning, they would begin moving their own people into position, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test everything she had learned about courage, trust, and the true meaning of patriotism. The elderly widow, who had simply wanted to restore her late husband's family farmhouse, was about to become the key figure in a battle for one of America's most precious historical treasures. Wednesday dawned grey and humid, with thick clouds that promised the rain Daniel had predicted. Earlier in the week, Margaret arrived at the farmhouse to find him already there, his truck positioned differently than usual, and his demeanor suggesting heightened alertness. The invisible presence of federal agents around the property created an atmosphere of anticipation that made even routine tasks feel charged with significance. "Sleep well?" Daniel asked as she approached, though his eyes were scanning their surroundings rather than focused on her. "Not particularly," Margaret admitted. "Too many thoughts about what we've gotten ourselves into." They had agreed the previous evening to maintain their normal renovation schedule while allowing Agent Collins's plan to unfold around them. The work would provide natural cover for their activities while creating opportunities for the Heritage Foundation to observe what appeared to be ongoing discoveries. As they entered the farmhouse, Margaret noticed subtle changes that indicated the FBI team had been busy overnight. Equipment that looked like renovation supplies, but was probably surveillance gear, strategic positioning of tools that would provide clear sightlines, and what appeared to be reinforcement of certain structural elements that might become important. "If the situation turned violent, they've been thorough," Daniel observed quietly, noting the same details that had caught Margaret's attention. The morning's work focused on the kitchen, where legitimate renovation needs provided perfect cover for their presence while allowing them to remain alert for any developments. Margaret found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, from settling timbers to wind rattling the windows, while Daniel maintained the steady focus of someone who had learned to function under pressure. It was just after 10 o'clock when the first test of Agent Collins's strategy occurred. A pickup truck approached the farmhouse, driven by a man Margaret didn't recognize, but whose appearance immediately set her on edge. He was well dressed for rural Pennsylvania, with expensive boots and clothing that suggested wealth rather than local farming background. "Mrs. Hartwell?" the man called as he stepped out of his vehicle, displaying a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Dr. Richard Pemberton from the Pennsylvania Historical Society. I understand you're doing restoration, work on this property." Margaret felt her chest tighten as she recognized the approach Agent Collins had warned them about. This man's credentials might be real, but his interest in the farmhouse was almost certainly connected to the Heritage Foundation's search for the declaration. "Dr. Pemberton?" she replied, accepting his offered business card while maintaining a polite distance. "How can I help you? I specialize in Revolutionary War period architecture and artifacts. This house has some fascinating historical connections that might be relevant to your restoration work." Pemberton's eyes were already cataloging details of the farmhouse's exterior, looking for signs of hidden spaces or unusual construction. Daniel emerged from the house, positioning himself slightly behind Margaret in a way that suggested protection. Without appearing threatening, his presence clearly made Pemberton uncomfortable, though the man attempted to maintain his scholarly facade. "Are you familiar with the Hartwell family's role during the Revolutionary War?" Pemberton asked, directing his question primarily to Margaret while keeping nervous glances toward Daniel. "Only generally," Margaret replied, following the script she and Agent Collins had developed. "We've found some old family documents during the renovation, but nothing that seemed historically significant." Pemberton's interest sharpened immediately. "What kind of documents?" "Letters, account books, that sort of thing, most of it too damaged by age to be readable." Margaret allowed a note of disappointment to enter her voice. "I was hoping to find something that would help with authenticating the house's history, but it's been frustrating. The fabricated story was designed to suggest that significant documents existed while implying they were damaged beyond useful recovery. If Pemberton represented the Heritage Foundation, this information would indicate that the hiding places had been found, but their contents might be compromised." "I'd be happy to examine any documents you've recovered," Pemberton offered. "Sometimes items that appear damaged can be restored using modern conservation techniques." Margaret exchanged a glance with Daniel, playing the role of cautious property owners considering an offer from a legitimate expert. "That's generous of you, Dr. Pemberton, but we've already contacted a preservation specialist in Philadelphia. They're sending someone out next week." The mention of another expert clearly disturbed Pemberton, though he attempted to hide his reaction. Of course. Professional conservation is always wise, but if you'd like a preliminary assessment before then, I'd be happy to take a look." Daniel stepped forward, his carpenter's instincts providing perfect cover for interrogating the visitor. "Dr. Pemberton, what specifically do you know about this property's history? We've been having trouble finding detailed records." Pemberton's answer revealed knowledge that was far too specific for casual academic interest. He knew about property transfers in the 1840s, about family members who had lived in the house during specific periods, and about modifications to the structure that weren't documented in any public records Margaret had been able to locate. "You seem very well informed about our family history," Margaret observed. "The Hartwells are quite famous in certain academic circles," Pemberton replied smoothly. "Jonathan Hartwell's work as a printer during the Revolutionary War period makes this property significant for understanding how information was distributed during that era." The direct reference to Jonathan Hartwell's printing work confirmed that Pemberton's interest was far from casual. Agent Collins had been right about the Heritage Foundation's knowledge of the property's history and their systematic approach to locating the hidden declaration. "I appreciate your interest, Dr. Pemberton," Margaret said, "but as I mentioned, we already have arrangements for examining any historical materials we find. Perhaps when that process is complete, we might have something to share with academic researchers." Pemberton's frustration was becoming more visible, despite his attempts at scholarly courtesy. "Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you understand the historical significance of properly preserving Revolutionary War artifacts. Items of that period require immediate professional attention to prevent deterioration." "Which is exactly why we're working with conservation specialists," Daniel interjected firmly. "Thanks for stopping by, Dr. Pemberton, but we need to get back to work before the weather turns." After Pemberton left, clearly disappointed by his inability to gain access to the farmhouse or its contents, Margaret and Daniel waited 15 minutes before using the communication device Agent Collins had provided. "Contact made," Margaret reported. "Dr. Richard Pemberton from the Pennsylvania Historical Society. Claimed academic interest, but knew far too much about specific family history." Agent Collins's voice came through clearly. "We have him under surveillance. Pemberton is a legitimate academic, but he's been providing consulting services to the Heritage Foundation for the past year. His visit confirms they're moving into active reconnaissance phase. The confirmation that their morning visitor was connected to the criminal organization sent adrenaline through Margaret's system. What had seemed like an academic inquiry was actually the beginning of a more aggressive campaign to locate and steal the declaration. "What happens next?" Daniel asked into the communication device. "Continue your normal activities, but be prepared for escalation." Pemberton's report will likely trigger more direct action within the next 24 hours. Agent Collins paused before continuing. Mrs. Hartwell, you should know that we've detected unusual activity around your Lancaster apartment as well. The Heritage Foundation is conducting surveillance on multiple fronts. The news that criminals were watching her home, as well as the farmhouse, made Margaret realize how completely her life had been infiltrated by this investigation. There was no longer any aspect of her routine that wasn't potentially dangerous. They spent the remainder of the morning working on legitimate renovation tasks while processing the implications of Pemberton's visit. The FBI's operation was clearly progressing according to plan, but Margaret found herself wondering what would happen when the Heritage Foundation moved beyond reconnaissance to direct action. Her question was answered sooner than expected. Shortly after noon, Daniel noticed movement in the woods behind the farmhouse, figures that appeared to be conducting systematic surveillance of the property from concealed positions. "We're being watched," he reported quietly, using hand signals to indicate the approximate locations of the observers. Margaret felt her chest constrict as she realized they were no longer dealing with casual inquiries or academic visits. Professional surveillance suggested the Heritage Foundation was preparing for some kind of operation, possibly including illegal entry or outright theft. "Agent Collins," she whispered into the communication device. "We have company in the woods, multiple positions. Confirmed, we have them under observation. Continue your activities normally. Do not acknowledge their presence." The agent's voice carried calm authority that helped steady Margaret's nerves. The afternoon's work took on surreal quality as Margaret and Daniel continued repairing kitchen cabinets while knowing that criminal organizations and federal law enforcement were maneuvering around them in an elaborate game of deception and surveillance. It was during their lunch break, sitting on the farmhouse porch in apparent casual conversation, that Margaret noticed the first signs of more aggressive action. A van had parked on the county road, positioned to observe all approaches to the property, while additional vehicles were stationed at strategic points around the perimeter. "They're setting up for something," Daniel observed, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension in his posture. Margaret's communication device buzzed with an incoming message from Agent Collins. "Intercepts indicate Heritage Foundation planning night operation. Suggest you leave property by 4 p.m. and remain at secure location until further notice." The message confirmed Margaret's growing sense that events were moving beyond her control. What had begun as cooperation with federal law enforcement was becoming active participation in a potentially violent confrontation. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I think we need to discuss what we're comfortable with. This situation is escalating beyond what either of us signed up for." Daniel set down his coffee cup and studied her face carefully. "Margaret, I've been thinking the same thing, but I keep coming back to the fact that these Heritage Foundation people aren't going to disappear just because we wish they would. If we back out now, you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." His assessment matched Margaret's own reluctant conclusion. The criminal organization hunting for the declaration had already invested too much time and resources to abandon their search. Withdrawal from Agent Collins's operation would leave her vulnerable to people who had demonstrated their willingness to kill for artifacts of lesser significance than what she had discovered. "Besides," Daniel continued, "we're not really civilians anymore. The moment you found that document, we became part of something bigger than a simple renovation project. We can try to hide from that reality, but it won't change the facts." Margaret nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in his analysis. The declaration had made her a target, regardless of her preferences, and cooperation with federal law enforcement offered her best chance of surviving the situation while ensuring the document's protection. They spent the afternoon completing as much work as possible while maintaining awareness of the increasing activity around the property. By 3 o'clock, Margaret counted at least 8 vehicles positioned at various points around the farmhouse, some clearly associated with the Heritage Foundation, and others presumably containing FBI agents. "Time to go," Daniel said as they packed up their tools. "Whatever's going to happen tonight, we don't want to be caught in the middle of it." As they secured the farmhouse and prepared to leave, Margaret felt a complex mixture of anticipation and regret. The building that had represented a simple connection to her late husband's family history had become the focal point of a federal law enforcement operation. Whether she would ever be able to return to the quiet renovation project she had originally envisioned seemed increasingly unlikely. The drive back to Lancaster took them past several of the vehicles they had identified as surveillance units, confirming that the Heritage Foundation's operation was indeed large-scale and well-organized. Margaret realized she was no longer dealing with casual criminals, but with people who approached artifact theft with military-level planning and resources. That evening, safe in her apartment, but knowing she remained under protective surveillance, Margaret examined the declaration one final time before the night's events would likely determine its ultimate fate. The document that had survived, hidden for over a century, was about to become the center of a confrontation that would test everything she had learned about courage, loyalty, and the responsibilities that came with protecting America's historical treasures. Thursday morning arrived with an eerie stillness that made Margaret's apartment feel like a holding cell, despite Agent Collins's assurance that she was under protective surveillance. Her phone had remained silent since the previous evening's terse message. "Operation postponed. Subjects withdrew unexpectedly. Maintain secure location until further notice." The sudden change in plans left her with nervous energy and no outlet except pacing from window to window, watching for signs of activity that might indicate whether federal agents or Heritage Foundation operatives were maintaining their watch. At precisely 8 o'clock, her landline rang with the sharp urgency that only unexpected calls seemed to carry. Margaret hesitated before answering, wondering if Agent Collins had news about the night's developments, or if someone else entirely was attempting to make contact. "Mrs. Hartwell?" The voice belonged to Daniel, but his tone carried a tension she hadn't heard before. "I need you to listen carefully and not ask questions until I finish. Something's gone wrong with the FBI operation, and we may be in immediate danger." Margaret's chest tightened as she settled into the chair beside her phone, gripping the receiver with both hands. What happened? The Heritage Foundation didn't hit the farmhouse last night because they discovered the FBI surveillance. Instead, they've changed tactics completely. They're not trying to steal the declaration anymore, Margaret. They're planning to destroy it. The words struck Margaret like physical blows. Destroy it? Why would they want to destroy such a valuable artifact? Because they can't have it, and more importantly, because they can't allow it to be authenticated and displayed publicly. Daniel's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent hours thinking through implications she was only beginning to grasp. "Agent Collins called me an hour ago. They intercepted communications indicating that the Heritage Foundation represents interests that would be seriously damaged if certain Revolutionary War documents became public knowledge." Margaret struggled to process this information. What interests? What could be damaging about the Declaration of Independence? Not the Declaration itself, but the authentication documents we found in the chimney. Some of those letters contain information about other artifacts, other hiding places, other documents that were concealed during the same period. Daniel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Margaret, we may have stumbled onto evidence of a systematic effort to hide American founding documents that contained information someone wanted suppressed." The implications were staggering. If the Heritage Foundation represented people who had been systematically suppressing historical documents for generations, then Margaret's discovery threatened not just individual collectors, but entire networks built around controlling access to American history. "Where are you now?" she asked. "At the farmhouse. Agent Collins wanted someone here in case they try to burn the place down. The hiding spots need to be protected until the authentication process is complete." Daniel paused, and Margaret could hear wind rattling windows in the background. "Margaret, there's something else. Agent Collins isn't sure all of her team members can be trusted. She thinks the Heritage Foundation may have infiltrated federal law enforcement. The possibility that FBI agents might be working, for the criminals sent ice through Margaret's veins. If Agent Collins couldn't trust her own people, then Margaret couldn't be certain that her protective surveillance was actually protective rather than predatory." "What does she want us to do?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would require more courage than she felt capable of mustering. "She wants you to bring the declaration here, to the farmhouse, today. She's going to authenticate it using equipment her team brought from Washington, then transfer it immediately to secure federal custody before anyone can interfere." Daniel's voice carried reluctant resolve. "Margaret, I know this sounds insane, but she thinks it's the only way to protect the document and end this threat permanently." Margaret looked around her apartment, at the life she had built after Robert's death, at the simple routines that had sustained her through months of grief and adjustment. Bringing the declaration to the farmhouse would mean abandoning safety for direct participation in whatever confrontation Agent Collins was planning. "How do I know Agent Collins is still trustworthy?" she asked. "If the Heritage Foundation has infiltrated federal law enforcement, how can we be certain she's not compromised as well?" "Because she's the one who discovered the infiltration. She showed me intercepted communications that prove someone in her unit has been feeding information to the Heritage Foundation." Daniel's voice carried conviction that helped steady Margaret's nerves. "Margaret, I've spent time with these people. Agent Collins is legitimate, but she's also isolated. We may be the only allies she has left." The thought of a federal agent, cut off from support and surrounded by potential enemies, appealed to Margaret's instinct to help people in desperate situations. But it also meant that bringing the declaration to the farmhouse would put all three of them at enormous risk. "Give me 2 hours," she said finally. "I need to make arrangements and figure out how to transport the document safely." After ending the call, Margaret sat in her kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold while she wrestled with decisions that could determine not only her own fate, but the preservation of one of America's most important historical artifacts. The safe deposit box at First National Bank contained more than just a document. It held proof of her country's founding principles and evidence of the extraordinary lengths people had gone to preserve those principles for future generations. The drive to the bank felt like traveling through a landscape that had become foreign overnight. Every car seemed potentially threatening, every pedestrian a possible surveillance operative. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she signed the forms necessary to access her safe deposit box, and she found herself studying the bank employees for signs of unusual interest in her activities. The declaration lay in its protective tube, exactly as she had left it, but handling it now felt different. What had once been a private treasure requiring careful preservation had become a weapon in a battle she was only beginning to understand. Margaret wrapped the tube in additional protective material before placing it in a canvas bag that would attract no attention during transport. The drive to the farmhouse took 43 minutes, during which Margaret found herself alternately second-guessing her decision and steeling herself for whatever confrontation lay ahead. The landscape that had seemed peaceful just days earlier now felt charged with potential violence. Every copse of trees a possible hiding place for enemies whose motives she couldn't fully comprehend. Daniel's truck was parked in its usual position, when she arrived, but Margaret immediately noticed additional vehicles positioned around the property. Two sedans that appeared to be government issue sat near the barn, while a panel van, equipped with what looked like sophisticated communication equipment, had been positioned to overlook approaches from multiple directions. Agent Collins emerged from the farmhouse as Margaret parked, her professional composure intact, but her eyes carrying the strain of someone operating under extreme pressure. Two other agents flanked her, both men Margaret recognized from the previous day's operation, but whose loyalties she now had reason to question. "Mrs. Hartwell," Agent Collins said, approaching with careful neutrality. "Thank you for coming. I know this situation has become more complex than any of us anticipated." Margaret clutched the canvas bag containing the declaration, studying the agent's face for signs of deception or ulterior motives. "Daniel said you've discovered infiltration within your team. How do I know I can trust anyone here?" "Because you don't have any choice," Agent Collins replied bluntly. "The Heritage Foundation has escalated to direct threats against your safety. They've abandoned attempts to steal the declaration in favor of eliminating you and destroying any evidence of what you've found." The stark assessment confirmed Margaret's growing understanding that withdrawal from the situation was no longer possible. Whether she cooperated with Agent Collins or attempted to flee, she remained a target for people who viewed her knowledge as an unacceptable threat. "Show me the authentication equipment," Margaret said, making the decision that would determine the next phase of her involvement. Agent Collins led her into the farmhouse, where the main room had been transformed into a sophisticated laboratory. Equipment that Margaret didn't recognize, but that appeared both expensive and specialized, occupied tables throughout the space, while computer monitors displayed what appeared to be comparison images of historical documents. "Dr. Sarah Chen," Agent Collins said, introducing a woman in her 50s who was calibrating one of the machines. "She's the Smithsonian's leading expert on Revolutionary War period documents. She flew in from Washington specifically to examine your discovery." Dr. Chen looked up from her equipment with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to working with priceless artifacts. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand you've been protecting this document for several days now. That took considerable courage, considering what you were up against." Margaret withdrew the tube from her canvas bag, feeling the weight of history and responsibility as she prepared to surrender the declaration to expert examination. "How long will authentication take?" "Preliminary assessment, about 2 hours. Complete analysis would normally require weeks, but we're working under emergency conditions." Dr. Chen accepted the tube with reverent care. "Mrs. Hartwell, I want you to understand what you've preserved. If this document proves authentic, it will rewrite portions of American revolutionary history." As Dr. Chen began her examination, Margaret found herself drawn into the technical details of authentication. The parchment's composition, the ink's chemical properties, the paper's age and origin, all provided clues about the document's authenticity and historical context. Each test seemed to confirm what Margaret had suspected since her first examination. The declaration was genuine, created during the Revolutionary War period using methods and materials consistent with Jonathan Hartwell's documented work. It was during the spectral analysis of the ink that Dr. Chen made a discovery that changed everyone's understanding of what they were dealing with. "This is extraordinary," she said, studying readings on her equipment. "The ink composition matches samples from other confirmed Jonathan Hartwell documents, but there's something else. Hidden text, written in iron gall ink that's become visible under ultraviolet examination." Agent Collins moved to examine the monitor displaying the hidden text. "What does it say?" Dr. Chen adjusted her equipment to enhance the contrast, revealing additional text that had been invisible under normal light. "It appears to be a message from Jonathan Hartwell, written directly on the declaration sometime after its creation." He's describing the locations of other hidden documents, other caches of Revolutionary War materials that were concealed for safekeeping. Margaret stared at the monitor, watching as centuries-old text emerged from the parchment like messages from the grave. Jonathan Hartwell hadn't just hidden one document. He had created an entire network of concealed archives containing materials that someone had wanted to keep from public knowledge. No wonder the Heritage Foundation wants to destroy this, Daniel said quietly. It's not just one document. It's a roadmap to dozens of other hidden artifacts. Agent Collins was already on her radio, reporting the discovery to superiors in Washington, while requesting additional resources for what had suddenly become a much larger operation. But her radio crackled with static, then went silent, suggesting that communication with federal support had been severed. "We have a problem," she announced, checking her equipment with growing concern. "All federal communications have been jammed. We're cut off from outside support." The implications struck everyone simultaneously. If communications were being jammed, it meant the Heritage Foundation had moved beyond surveillance and infiltration to active interference with federal operations. The farmhouse, which had seemed like a secure location for authentication, had become a trap. "How many people do you trust completely?" Margaret asked Agent Collins. "In this room?" "3. You, Daniel, and Dr. Chen. Everyone else is potentially compromised." Agent Collins moved to the window, studying the countryside with professional assessment. "Mrs. Hartwell, we need to complete this authentication immediately and get the declaration to secure federal custody before the Heritage Foundation can interfere." But even as Dr. Chen worked frantically to complete her examination, the sound of approaching vehicles suggested that time was running out. The Heritage Foundation had apparently decided that direct confrontation was preferable to continued surveillance, and Margaret realized she was about to face the most dangerous test of her unexpected journey from grieving widow to guardian of American history. The battle for the Declaration of Independence was about to begin in earnest, and Margaret Hartwell found herself at the center of a confrontation that would determine not only the document's fate, but the preservation of historical truths that powerful interests had spent generations trying to suppress. The sound of approaching engines grew louder as Margaret watched Agent Collins move with practiced efficiency to secure the farmhouse's perimeter. Dr. Chen continued her frantic work with the authentication equipment, her hands steady despite the obvious tension in her shoulders, while Daniel positioned himself near the window with a clear view of the approaching vehicles. 6 trucks, maybe 7, Daniel reported, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone who had learned to function under pressure. "They're not trying to hide their approach anymore." Agent Collins checked her sidearm before moving to a communications console that appeared more sophisticated than standard FBI equipment. "Dr. Chen, how much more time do you need?" 10 minutes for preliminary confirmation, maybe 15 for documentation that would hold up in court, Dr. Chen replied, without looking up from her instruments. "But Mrs. Hartwell, even if we don't complete the full process, what I've seen already confirms this is authentic. Jonathan Hartwell's hidden message alone makes this one of the most significant Revolutionary War discoveries in American history." Margaret felt a complex mixture of pride and terror as she realized the magnitude of what she had stumbled upon. The Declaration wasn't just a copy of America's founding document. It was a key to understanding how the nation's earliest patriots had protected democratic principles against forces that wanted to suppress them. "Ma'am," one of Agent Collins's team members called from his position near the back door, "we have movement in the woods behind the house. At least 4 individuals, armed, approaching from the northeast." Agent Collins cursed quietly before turning to Margaret and Daniel. "This is what I was afraid of. The Heritage Foundation isn't just trying to steal the Declaration anymore. They're planning to eliminate everyone who knows about it." The stark assessment sent adrenaline through Margaret's system, but also triggered a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. Then we make sure they don't succeed. This document has survived hidden for over a century. It's not going to be destroyed on my watch." Agent Collins looked at her with surprise and respect. "Mrs. Hartwell, you don't understand what you're saying. These people are professionals. They've killed federal agents before. And I'm a 73-year-old librarian who spent 40 years helping people find information they needed," Margaret replied firmly. "I understand exactly what I'm saying. Some things are worth fighting for, and American history is one of them." Daniel moved away from the window to stand beside Margaret, his expression reflecting the same determination she felt building within herself. "Agent Collins, what do you need us to do?" Before she could answer, the sound of breaking glass from upstairs indicated that the Heritage Foundation had begun their assault. Agent Collins immediately began issuing orders to her team, but Margaret could see the tactical situation was desperate. The farmhouse might be defensible against casual intruders, but not against a coordinated attack by experienced operatives. "Dr. Chen," Margaret said, moving to the authentication equipment, "can this analysis be completed somewhere else?" "Somewhere. Safer? The equipment is portable, but we'd need at least 30 minutes to pack everything properly." Dr. Chen looked up from her instruments with obvious reluctance to abandon her work. "Mrs. Hartwell, what I've discovered changes everything we thought we knew about document preservation during the Revolutionary War period." Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. "Then we don't run. We finish the work here and we protect what needs protecting." Agent Collins stared at her with disbelief. "Mrs. Hartwell, this isn't a library research project. These people will kill you without hesitation." "Maybe they will, but they'll have to get through me first, and I'm tougher than I look." Margaret moved to the fireplace, where Daniel had discovered the hidden compartment containing Jonathan Hartwell's printing equipment. "Besides, we have advantages they don't know about." She began removing items from the concealed storage space, including tools and materials that might prove useful for protecting the Declaration and its authentication. Among Jonathan Hartwell's carefully preserved possessions was a small arsenal of Revolutionary War period weapons, maintained in working condition and stored with ammunition that appeared remarkably well preserved. "Margaret," Daniel said, examining one of the firearms with professional appreciation, "Jonathan Hartwell wasn't just a printer. He was prepared for exactly this kind of situation." Agent Collins looked at the cache of weapons with growing understanding. He expected that people would come looking for what he'd hidden. He prepared this place as a fortress, not just a hiding spot. The realization transformed their tactical situation immediately. The farmhouse hadn't been randomly chosen as a secure location. It had been specifically designed to withstand assault while protecting the documents and people inside. Jonathan Hartwell had been thinking 2 centuries ahead, preparing for the day when his hidden archives would need defending. "Dr. Chen," Margaret said, checking the loading of a pistol that felt surprisingly familiar in her hands, "how long do you actually need to complete documentation that would satisfy federal courts?" "With the equipment I have here, another hour." "But Mrs. Hartwell, we can't possibly hold this position for an hour against a coordinated attack." "We can, if we're smart about it." Margaret moved to the window, studying the approaching Heritage Foundation operatives with tactical assessment. That would have surprised her children if they could have seen her. "Daniel, you said the basement had multiple rooms. Are any of them defensible?" "The root cellar has stone walls 3 feet thick and only one entrance that could be secured." Daniel was already moving toward the basement stairs. "If we could get the authentication equipment down there, we'd have a fortress within a fortress." Agent Collins nodded approvingly. "That's actually brilliant. Dr. Chen, can your equipment function in a basement environment?" "As long as there's power and reasonable temperature control, yes. The authentication process doesn't require laboratory conditions, just precise instrumentation." Within minutes, they had begun moving the essential equipment to the basement root cellar, a process that required careful coordination while Heritage Foundation operatives continued their approach. Margaret found herself functioning with efficiency that surprised everyone, including herself, organizing the transfer of materials. While maintaining watch for immediate threats, it was Agent Collins who noticed the most ominous development. They've stopped advancing. They're setting up some kind of perimeter around the entire property. Margaret joined her at the window, studying the Heritage Foundation positions with growing unease. They're not planning to assault the house. They're planning to besiege it, which means they have time on their side and we don't. Agent Collins checked her weapon again before turning to face the group. Mrs. Hartwell, I need to be completely honest with you. Federal backup isn't coming. The Heritage Foundation has resources at levels I didn't fully understand until today. We're on our own. The admission might have been devastating under other circumstances, but Margaret found it oddly liberating. Without federal bureaucracy to consider or chain of command to navigate, they could focus entirely on protecting the declaration and completing its authentication. Then we finish what we started, she said simply. Dr. Chen, how can we help you work faster? The next hour unfolded with surreal intensity as Dr. Chen continued her authentication process in the basement, while Margaret, Daniel, and Agent Collins maintained defensive positions throughout the farmhouse. The Heritage Foundation operatives seemed content to maintain their perimeter, suggesting they were waiting for additional resources or favorable conditions for their assault. Margaret, Daniel called from his position near the back door, I'm seeing movement that suggests they're preparing to cut our utilities. Once the power goes out, Dr. Chen won't be able to complete her work. Then we need backup power. Margaret remembered seeing a generator among Jonathan Hartwell's carefully preserved equipment. Check the barn. There might be emergency power supplies stored with everything else. As Daniel prepared to make the dangerous journey to the barn, Dr. Chen's voice called from the basement with excitement that overrode fear. I've got it. Complete authentication. Documentation that will satisfy any court in the country. This declaration is absolutely genuine, and the hidden text reveals locations of at least 12 other document caches throughout the original 13 colonies. The confirmation of authentication represented a victory that transcended their immediate danger. Whatever happened to them personally, the truth about Jonathan Hartwell's document preservation network was now officially recorded and documented. Dr. Chen, Agent Collins called down to the basement, can you transmit that authentication to federal databases remotely? If I can get a secure internet connection, yes. The documentation can be uploaded immediately to Smithsonian servers and FBI archives simultaneously. Margaret felt a surge of hope as she realized they might be able to protect the Declaration's legacy, even if they couldn't protect themselves. The farmhouse has internet service. If we can maintain power long enough for transmission, the Heritage Foundation won't be able to suppress what we've discovered. But their optimism was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching from multiple directions, suggesting that the Heritage Foundation was preparing for final action. Agent Collins moved between windows, counting the additional forces arraying against them. 15 vehicles now, maybe 60 people. They're not taking any chances. She turned to face Margaret and Daniel with grim resolve. This is where we make our stand. Mrs. Hartwell, you've given us the most important Revolutionary War discovery in decades. Whatever happens now, that achievement can't be taken away. Margaret looked around the farmhouse that had become the unlikely fortress for defending American history, at the people who had become her allies in ways she never could have imagined when she first inserted those brass keys in the front door lock. The widow who had simply wanted to renovate her late husband's family property was now the central figure in a battle that would determine whether suppressed historical truths would finally see the light of day. Agent Collins, she said, checking. The Revolutionary War period pistol one final time. Let's finish this properly. Jonathan Hartwell spent his life protecting democratic principles. The least we can do is honor that commitment. The Heritage Foundation's final assault was about to begin, but Margaret Hartwell was ready. She had found courage she didn't know she possessed, allies she couldn't have imagined, and purpose that transcended her personal fears. The Declaration of Independence had already been authenticated and documented. Now it remained only to ensure that the truth about America's founding principles would survive whatever violence was about to unfold around the farmhouse where those principles had been secretly protected for over 2 centuries. The battle for American history was reaching its climax, and an elderly widow had become the unlikely guardian of truths that powerful interests had spent generations trying to suppress. The Heritage Foundation's assault began with a coordinated attack on the farmhouse's power lines, plunging the building into darkness, except for the emergency lighting Dr. Chen had rigged to her authentication equipment. Margaret found herself pressed against a window frame, the Revolutionary War pistol steady in her hands as she watched armed figures advance through the pre-dawn gloom. "Power's out, but I've got battery backup for another 20 minutes, Dr. Chen called from the basement. "If I can establish internet connection, I can upload everything to federal servers before they reach us." Agent Collins moved through the farmhouse with practiced efficiency, checking defensive positions and coordinating with her remaining trusted team members. "Mrs. Hartwell, I want you to know that regardless of what happens here, you've already won. The truth about that declaration will survive." Margaret felt a calm settle over her that she recognized from the months following Robert's death, the acceptance that came when circumstances moved beyond personal control. "Agent Collins, my husband used to say that some things are worth more than safety. I never really understood what he meant until now." The first shots came from the Heritage Foundation operatives positioned near the barn, testing the farmhouse's defenses and drawing return fire from Agent Collins's team. But Margaret quickly realized that the attackers weren't trying to storm the building. They were creating a distraction while other operatives approached from unexpected directions. "Daniel," she called to her renovation partner, who had positioned himself near the kitchen window, "they're not coming through the front. Check the basement access from outside." Daniel's warning shout confirmed her suspicion. "Back entrance is compromised. They've found the old root cellar entrance." Dr. Chen's voice carried desperate urgency from below. "I need 3 more minutes. The upload is at 60%. Margaret made a decision that would have terrified her just weeks earlier. Leaving her defensive position, she descended into the basement, where Dr. Chen worked frantically over her equipment while Heritage Foundation operatives attempted to breach the external cellar door. "Dr. Chen, can you complete the upload if I buy you time?" Margaret asked, positioning herself between the authentication equipment and the cellar entrance, where the sound of tools against stone suggested imminent breakthrough. "Mrs. Hartwell, you can't face armed operatives with an antique pistol," Dr. Chen protested, though her hands never stopped working on the computer transmission. "I'm not facing them alone," Margaret replied, noticing that Daniel had followed her into the basement, along with Agent Collins and her remaining team member. The Heritage Foundation's breach of the cellar door came with explosive force, but the attackers found themselves facing not a helpless elderly woman, but a coordinated defense that included federal agents, a determined carpenter, and a librarian who had discovered reserves of courage she never knew existed. The firefight in the basement lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours to Margaret as she used Jonathan Hartwell's carefully preserved pistol to protect equipment that was documenting the most significant historical discovery of her lifetime. When the shooting stopped, 3 Heritage Foundation operatives lay wounded, while Dr. Chen's equipment continued its steady upload of authentication data to federal servers. Upload complete, Dr. Chen announced triumphantly. Full documentation is now in Smithsonian and FBI databases simultaneously. Even if they destroy the original document, the authentication is permanently preserved. Agent Collins emerged from the basement with grim satisfaction. Mrs. Hartwell, you've just accomplished something remarkable. The Heritage Foundation's century-long effort to suppress Revolutionary War documents has been permanently defeated, but their victory celebration was interrupted by the arrival of additional vehicles, these bearing federal law enforcement markings that appeared genuine. Margaret watched through basement windows as FBI agents in full tactical gear surrounded the remaining Heritage Foundation operatives, ending the siege with professional efficiency. Agent Williams, Agent Collins spoke into her radio with obvious relief. Situation secure, package authenticated and uploaded. Mrs. Hartwell performed exceptionally under fire. Within hours, the farmhouse was swarming with legitimate federal agents, historians, and media representatives drawn by news of the most significant Revolutionary War document discovery in decades. Margaret found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought, fielding questions about her background, her discovery, and her remarkable transformation from grieving widow to guardian of American history. Mrs. Hartwell, the reporter from the History Channel, asked, "What would you say to people who think ordinary citizens can't make a difference in preserving our nation's heritage?" Margaret looked around the farmhouse that had become the center of a national news story, at the authentication equipment that had proved her declaration genuine, at the people who had become unlikely allies in defending historical truth. "I'd say that history isn't just about famous people doing famous things," she replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes it's about ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and choose to do what's right instead of what's safe." 3 months later, Margaret stood in the Smithsonian Institution beside a display case containing the Hartwell Declaration, as it had become known in academic circles. The authentication had revealed not only the document's genuineness, but also the locations of 11 other Revolutionary War archives that had been systematically recovered and preserved. Daniel Mackenzie stood beside her, wearing a suit that looked uncomfortable but appropriate for the formal dedication ceremony. Their partnership had evolved from renovation project to historical preservation to something more personal that neither felt pressured to define precisely. "Any regrets about getting involved in all this?" Daniel asked as they watched visitors examine the display that told the story of Jonathan Hartwell's document preservation network. "Only that it took me 73 years to discover I was capable of this kind of adventure," Margaret replied with a smile that had become more frequent in recent months. The Hartwell farmhouse had been designated a National Historic Site, with Margaret serving as its first curator and Daniel as restoration supervisor. Together, they were turning the property into a research center for Revolutionary War document preservation, ensuring that Jonathan Hartwell's legacy would continue protecting American history for future generations. Agent Collins, now promoted, for her role in exposing Heritage Foundation infiltration of federal law enforcement, visited regularly to consult on security measures for the growing archive of recovered documents. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said during her most recent visit, "you realize you've started something that's going to change how we understand the Revolutionary War period." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with such recognition. But she also felt the satisfaction of purpose that had been missing from her life since Robert's death. The elderly widow who had simply wanted to renovate a farmhouse had become a guardian of American history, and the role suited her better than she could have imagined. As visitors continued to stream through the Hartwell historic site, drawn by the story of an ordinary woman who had made an extraordinary discovery, Margaret reflected on the journey that had transformed her from grieving widow to national figure. the Declaration of Independence that had hidden in her farmhouse for over a century was now safely preserved for all Americans to study and appreciate. But more importantly, the truth about how ordinary patriots had protected democratic principles against those who would suppress them was now part of the historical record. Sometimes, Margaret realized, the most important discoveries come not from seeking adventure, but from having the courage to protect what matters when adventure finds you. If this story of courage, history, and unexpected heroism has inspired you, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, because tomorrow we have an incredible tale about a retired teacher who discovers a hidden underground railroad station in her basement and realizes it's still being used. You won't want to miss how one woman's curiosity leads to uncovering a modern mystery that changes everything she thought she knew about her quiet neighborhood. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these amazing stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things.